Yes.
Right. Good afternoon, everyone. I don't think this is a mic for this room. I think it's for the virtual people. It's a pleasure having you all here on a Friday that is sunny outside. So thank you very much for coming to see Professor Helina Jolie. So Helina came from the US, from the University of Vermont, and she has quite an interesting trajectory, which I think many people in this room are also going through that journey, which is starting as a zoologist in conservation science and slowly migrating to the social science based on the conflicts that she has experienced on the ground with her research. So she works with indigenous knowledge, human wildlife conflict, with extensive knowledge in India, especially, but now trying to decolonize science and conservation, especially in the global south. So please give a round of applause to Helina.
Thank you, Erica, for the introduction. And thank you everyone for coming today. I've been told that it's a sunny day and most people in UK tend to be out when there is sun. So thank you for making it for the presentation. Where do I start? Let me start by saying that, the conversations and insights that I'm going to present here belongs to communities and people I've worked with. I'm here as a voice. And so I really hope you enjoy. And I don't see this presentation or a talk in general as something I'm kind of giving as a prescribed way of doing things, but probably something to like start thinking, maybe something that might make people uncomfortable, maybe something that would just make you think more deeply and in a different way from what we've been used to. In 2016, I grew up in Kerala, south of India. And in 2016, when I returned back to start my PhD fieldwork in Western Ghats, taking a walk with a community member, the person asked me a question that kind of changed the pathway of my entire research, and I would say in general, my career path in itself. The question I was asked was, what if wild animals were not managed, but listened to? And what if they were intelligent and sentient beings like us? Having been trained in zoology, I've always seen and studied animals as species. And for me, this idea of animals being intelligent and sentient beings was something that was not very comfortable to think through. So my immediate reaction was, well, we are different from them. We are intelligent, we are exceptional, we have thoughts, we process things, we have decision-making ability. And the elder laughed and he said, you have so much to learn about things and the world. And I started thinking about it, and this quote kind of remained with me for a long time. And even now I use it in several of my talks and presentation, that why did I give that instant answer without even taking a moment to think? I believe partly it's because how I was trained to think about the natural world. Like ever since the Neolithic time, we have distanced ourselves from other species, modifying our language, our laws, and our thoughts accordingly. A person is a he or a she, an animal is an it. We have thoughts, they have instincts. We have language, they have vocalizations. We have culture, they just run around in the woods doing whatever they do. The questions the community member asked me were not just rhetorical questions. For me, they were philosophical realizations. These questions kind of question the foundational assumption of what human-nature relationship looks like. Either it's built on an extractive rationale, that nature is a resource that humans need to benefit out of, or it's often from a protectionist approaches that, oh, we need to save nature. Humans are meant to save the nature. We need to do something about it. In contrast, many indigenous and traditional societies do not prescribe to these outlooks. So in my work, I've approached this particular question of understanding human-nature relation from these three different themes. One is characterizing what does these knowledge systems entail, studying and working with indigenous communities and traditional societies on their ways of knowing and coexisting with the local environment. Understanding or illuminating the knowledge and practices which has been erased actively and intentionally by colonial and post-colonial policies. Third, collaborate to co-design community-based conservation approaches and governance models. And in my work, I use a combination of methodologies, mostly qualitative research methods. It involves ethnographic work and collaborative research designs. I often use an inductive research approach. I'm sure most audience here are familiar with the approach. So instead of going and meeting the community with a certain set of questions, you go with a more open mind and trying to understand what are some of the themes and topics that community is interested to work with, and then try to design your research around their needs and their kind of aspirations of what that research would look like for them. So participatory and story-driven methods are another way. So for instance, in my method, I use kind of a multi-sensory way of looking at things. So to give an example would be why this particular method was very effective for me is every time I was asking a question about forests to some of the community members in Western Ghats, they told me the most beautiful part of forest is vayal. Vayal is a Malayalam word. Vayal in normal translation would be rice paddy field. And first interview, second interview, the description of the beautiful part being paddy field in the forest didn't sit really well with me. So a community member said, why don't you come inside the forest? Let me show you what a vayal is. Having grown up there, my whole description about vayal was this whole idea of paddy field. And when I walked in and community member showed me, it was a wetland. And that's what they called vayal. And it was spectacular to watch the wetlands in between the mountains. And it looked beautiful. There were different plants, different birds, different other species and interaction. So it's not just listening to the community members. Often the methods involve going and seeing, feeling, touching, smelling, hearing what they're talking about. It also involves long-term relationship. Very often when we do research, we see information as data. And data is kind of a very non-living form of what it is. But community shares information which are some of their lived experiences, their life forms, their oral histories, their entwined geographies and stories. So it's not data. So you need to engage with them from a lens that these are living knowledge bodies, which means you need to build relationship, you need to build trust, you need to build respect to get access to these kind of information, rather than just thinking that we are entitled to walk in and get the information and use it. I want to share a small video which I took during my field work about the community member harvesting honey from the trees. Now, the reason I'm showing is that I also engage with a lot of multimedia, like documentaries and art-based form when I work with the community. And I find, I think the volume. I would request you to pay attention to the subtitles where it's kind of a conversation the community member is having with the honeybees.
ಒಂದು ವರ್ಷ ನಂಗನೆ ಬಂದು ಕಾಪಾಡಿ ನಂಗ ಹೊಟ್ಟೆ ಹಸಿತೆ ಲೋಗತೇಡಿ ಮರ ಹೂಸಿ ಸರ್ ಮಳೆ ಬೀಳಲ್ಲ ನಂಗ ಬೇಕಾದೀವ ಲೋಗತೇಡಿ ಮರ ಬಂದು ನಂಗ ಹೇಳ್ತಾನು ತಪ್ಪನು ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಮರ ಹೋಗಿ ಆಗಿದ್ದರೆ ಹತ್ತಿ ಆಗದ ಒಂದು ಬಲ ಮಾಡಿ ಜೇನು ಬರ್ತೀನಿ ಪಾಪ ಟೈಮ್ಗ ನಂಗ ಎಲ್ಲ ಹೊಟ್ಟೆ ಹಚ್ಚಿಬಿಟ್ಟಾಗ ಅದ್ರ ತಂಗಿ ಕೈ ಕೂಲಾಯಿ ಅದ್ರ ಮನೆ ಹಿಡಿದು ಕುದಿಯಲ್ಲ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿ ತೆಕ್ಕಿ ಎರಕಿ ನಾಲ್ಕು ತಿಂದು ಜನ ಜನ ಕಡಿಮೆ ಕೈತು ನೋಡಿದಲೇ ಕೊಳ್ಳ ಮನೆ ಲಂಗನ ಸಗದ ತಿರುಳಕೊಳ್ಳ ಇದನ್ನ ನಂಗೆ ಕೊಟ್ಟು ಬೇರೆ ಹೋಗಿ ಒಳ್ಳೆ ಮನೆ ಕಟ್ಟಿ ಎರಡು ಮಕ್ಕಳ ಕೂದಲ ಬರ್ತಿ
അപ്പം ചേട്ടൻ തേൻ എടുക്കുമ്പോൾ മുഴുവനായിട്ട് എടുത്തില്ല, കുറച്ച്
കുറച്ച് നമ്മളവിടെ മുകളിൽ വെച്ചു, എന്നിട്ട് പകുതിയാണ് നമ്മൾ എടുത്തിരിക്കുന്നത്.
എന്തിനാ കുറച്ച് ബാക്കി വെച്ചത്?
അവിടെ ഈച്ചക്ക് ഒരു വേറെ പിന്നെ അതിന്റെ വീട് ആവണ്ട എന്ന് വെച്ചിട്ടാണ് കുറച്ച് ബാക്കി വെക്കുന്നത്. മുഴുവൻ എടുത്താൽ നമുക്ക് ഒരു മനസ്സിന് രസം ഇഷ്ടപ്പെടില്ല. അതിന് രസം വെക്കണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ഇത്ര ദിവസം കഷ്ടപ്പെട്ട കുറച്ച് അതിന് വെക്കണം. പകുതി ഒഴിവാക്കി പകുതി ഉയർത്തു.
അപ്പം അടുത്ത വർഷം ആകുമ്പോൾ ഇവിടെ ഇനിയും തേനുകൾ
അത് ഇത് സാധനം അവിടേക്ക് എത്തിയിട്ട് നമ്മൾ കൂടുതൽ കൂടുതലായിട്ട് എത്തിയില്ല. കാടും തേനായിട്ട് നമ്മൾ അത്രയ്ക്ക് കുറച്ച് നമ്മൾ ബന്ധത്തിലാണ്. അപ്പൊ അതുകൊണ്ട് ടീച്ചർക്ക് കുത്തം നമ്മൾ കഴിക്കാം.
തേന് കാട്ടുനായ്ക്കൊക്കെ ഒരു പ്രധാനപ്പെട്ട കാര്യമാണ് അല്ലേ?
തേനെന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ നമ്മൾ ആദ്യം പഴയ കാലത്ത് ഇങ്ങനെ തേൻ കാട്ടിക്കാട് തിന്ന് ഇങ്ങനെ കൊണ്ടുവന്ന് തന്നതാണ്.
So in this small clip, you can see that it's connection they're talking about, it's relation, it's conversation. Even though he's collecting the honey as a non-timber forest product in mainstream language, but what he is talking is about connections and relations and how it's important to address and have a conversation with the animal that they are engaging with. I'm very fortunate that I got opportunity to work with some very kind and very beautiful communities across the world. So I've had opportunity to work with Miapyokuk First Nations in Canada, Kattunayakan people in India, and some traditional farming communities in Sri Lanka. I've worked on different kind of themes while working with these communities, mostly around the topics of human-wildlife coexistence. What does land management practices looks like for these communities, especially the cultural burning? What are the meanings and the values and the place-based knowledge that they have with the land that they've been forcefully evacuated from? What are the biocultural food system and how the impact of creation of protected areas has led to changes in their biocultural food system? In today's particular talk, given that a lot of you are involved in conservation-based work, I thought I will discuss more about the human-wildlife relationship part of it. Human-wildlife relationship is one of the oldest relationship in our history. It's deeply embedded in our culture, cosmology, whether it's in our cave paintings from the early times, whether it's in our stories, whether it's in our festivals, whether it's in our art form. Here you can see the cave paintings, the reference of, Red Riding Hood. It's a painting from Canada, Anishinaabe indigenous community. And towards the end, you have an art form from Southern India where people dress up as tigers and perform during the celebration. This interaction with human wildlife has shaped our behavior with the landscape, and it also changed and shaped animal behaviors and animal landscapes. We often see when we talk about relationship, there is this very deep-seated feeling of looking at it from a very romanticized notion, like, the pictures, the history, or, art form. But the reality of living very close to wildlife is not as beautiful as it's being described. Humans and animals often are competing for space and resources, especially in areas where human population is very high, there is very less limited land available for animals. And this interaction in some way brings challenges in form of like animals raiding your farms or humans destroying the animal habitats. And that particular thing becomes a lot of negative interactions. A quick question, how many of you have been chased by an elephant? Or great, there's one person. So it was one thing for me to really hear about elephant conflicts in Kerala but was another thing to like really getting chased by an elephant. It's a big mammal, but you know, they run so fast, like within few minutes, they're like out close in front of you, right? Just wanted to like show you a part of a chase. And even though in the video you can see the community members, we were like kind of laughing, but the situation was very scary, like to have an animal and a herd of elephants chasing. Imagine living in those spaces every day, like witnessing this and having to make that decision when you go into the forest, which pathways to take, always watching out your back, you know, whether you're going to encounter an elephant or a tiger. That's definitely not fun for community members. We have seen one side, which is human side, right? It's not fun to live close to animals. Now, if you were a coyote, a wolf, an elephant, or a tiger, it's no picnic living close to human beings either. Human beings have encroached into their land, changed their waterways, changed their food system. And now when they ever come into a human area, they face with conflict. This whole human-wildlife interaction, when it turns into conflict, it became in some way a huge discipline. Several researchers, several scientists, funding organization, NGOs, they've been working to understand how we can solve this kind of a crisis which is happening across the world. In some way, the field has grown tremendously. So to give a reference that how many times a scientific article references human-wildlife conflict instead of coexistence, it's just increased in number. Now, if you think about why we are giving a lot of interest to conflict, the term conflict, is because the paradigms in which conservation and natural science is rooted has fundamentally been in the principle of dualism. We believe the fact that human and nature needs to be kept separate. Like I said in the beginning, like, you know, humans are exceptional, humans have thoughts, you know, humans are beings with decision-making ability, right from the French philosopher in 1590s to then what we can see in 1872 with the establishment of Yellowstone National Park, which was seen as a milestone in conservation science in some way. What happens when we create these separations is the fact that people or indigenous communities who've been living in those spaces have been forcefully evacuated. You take the history of majority of the protected areas across the world, whether it's Asia, Africa, North America, anywhere in the world, you see marked evidences of social injustice and cultural erasure that has happened. So if you see the timeline, a very rough timeline, you can see from 1590s, 1872 to 2016, which is in India, where you can see that separation with fences and trench. Now, why is this problematic? Why is it problematic to only look at the conflict side? The framing around conflict in some way instills the notion that humans and wildlife or animals are in conflict or in kind of opposition with one another. We are not able to see the other complex relations and interactions which has been happening in those areas. Now, the solution for conflict is again separation, like creating trenches, electric fences. What are the ways of keeping humans and animals apart is even given as a solution. But these things have been working for years and it doesn't seem to be solving the problem. The human-wildlife conflict is on a rise in many parts of the world. Human population is increasing, animal population is increasing. At some point, it's going to be inevitable to keep both these separate. Now, what do we do then? In some places, they decide to kill animals who are problematic, or there is legal culling process where, they've been erased, or sometimes they're moved, they're relocated. But are these going to solve problems? Not really. Which is when several researchers started thinking, what's more than conflict? Is there a way of understanding human wildlife from a lens of coexistence? There are some brilliant work done by researchers like Neil Carter, Adrian Travis, Jennifer Glickman, Simon Pooley, who discuss about this understanding about human-wildlife coexistence. Coexistence was initially understood as a very passive form of existence, where you tend to tolerate animal because you've given some physical incentive or economic incentive. But in reality, science nowadays is understanding the fact that coexistence is in fact a very active and intentional choice that people in landscapes where they share with wildlife or wild animals have. And where do we look evidence for coexistence? How do we understand coexistence? What does it look like? We get a lot of our information on coexistence if you look closely at indigenous knowledge systems. Whether it's people in Harare region of Ethiopia who tend to have relationship with hyenas, or the Bhil people of Rajasthan in Western India who share kinship with leopards. These kind of observations led me to my own work trying to understand Kattunayakan people in southern India. How do they see animals? How do they engage with animals? Now, why did I decide to work with just this one community? So the Kattunayakan word in Malayalam language means Kadu, which is forest, and Nayakan mean leader. They call themselves the leaders of the forest. They're animistic communities, hunter foragers, who've been living in the forest for a long time, and their basic livelihood is engaging, foraging and hunting. In 1972, when nationally India came up with a policy of Wildlife Protection Act, several of the land area where these community members were living were turned into protected areas, partly for conservation of majestic charismatic animals like elephants and tigers. And these communities were pushed outside these ancestral land areas. Now, this is something everybody knows. Like, this is a kind of a playbook conservation, fortress conservation strategy, which is used mostly across the world. Now, the interesting part is that these communities are now in the fringe areas of the forest or protected area. They've been asked to move further because there is an increase in conflict. An increase in conflict becomes a reason for the communities to be pushed further away from these areas. So I was curious to know, for a community that's been living in close proximity with forests, what do they think about this whole understanding about interactions becoming conflict and coexistence? So this particular study led to this paper, which is Indigenous Insights on Human-Wildlife Coexistence in Southern India, in which the community discusses their understanding about animals. They understood animals as rational conversing personalities, as gods, teachers, and equals in the forest, and relatives with shared origin practicing dharma. I'm going to give details of these things in a bit. So rational conversing personality meant animals having ability to read human minds, engage in conversation, decision-making ability. Gods, teachers, and equals included them having understanding of animals are just like us humans. Animals are sometimes gods and teachers, and there needs to be a form of reverence and respect when you engage with animals. Animals were also seen as relatives with shared origin, forest being the parent and all the beings in the forest being children of the forest. By that function, animals are siblings, the shared understanding of their origin. Now, by seeing animals as rational conversing beings, Kattunayakan philosophies questions the centrality of humans in mediating human-wildlife interaction. They believe that it's not just the human perception of animals that's important. It's equally important to understand how animal perceives a human. They believe that animals are buddhiyulla jeevigal, or intelligent beings. They do things based on their shari and satya. Now, this particular quote came when I was interacting with a community member. He mentioned that, they engage in conversations with the animals. So he said, like, when you see an elephant in the forest, we usually tell the elephant that, listen, we are here to gather some things, food, our family is waiting for us. I mean, no harm to you. Can we move in our different path? So coming from my set of knowledge systems, for me, it was like, oh, you talk to the animal, do animal just agree to you and, move the way? So the community member just laughed and said, no, they are intelligent beings. They will make their decision based on their lived experiences and their truths and their rights. So there is no guarantee that particular conversation will lead to a situation where the animal will move away. It's just that a human trying to bring a mutual agreement with the animal. Coexistence in Kattunayakan worldview was convivial, but it also situates fear and conflict. It was not a romanticized notion of animals and humans dancing and living in a space very much like a movie scene or a kind of a fairy tale description. That was not it. They were very careful and very serious about their interaction with animals, and they treated it with utmost respect. In terms of convivial, it's a fact that they understand if you engage in conflict with an elephant in the forest, it doesn't automatically translate that every elephant you meet will behave in conflict pattern. For communities, they understood that every animal person in the forest has a different nature. Some elephants are angry and some are not. And when you engage with an animal that is angry, you tend to react. You could retaliate. The humans might also react in a different way from when they would meet an elephant which is not angry. For Kattunayakans, animals hold a high socio-cultural or socio-ecological position in a high socio-ecological order. Now, what does that mean? In their worldview or in their ontology, animals or their ancestors and teachers and elders often take form of animals, which means every time you meet an animal, there is a high possibility of that animal being your elder or deceased elder or ancestor or a god, which meant every time you see an animal, you often behave in a respectful and reverence pattern rather than risking, offending an ancestor or a teacher. Now, it's also interesting that this particular socio-ecological order translates really into physical sense. They think like an animal like elephant is a big, physically big animal, and that needs space to walk. So if you see elephant, it's your duty to move and give path to elephant to move and perform the task, because that's a big animal. In their own words, it's a big person, and the big person needs big spaces. For Kattunayakans, they often socio-rationalize animal behavior. They think we have been living with these animals for such a long time. We believe animals are also part of forests just like them. This also translates and extends into their understanding that every being in the forest has rights to food or forest resources, and it's their responsibility to give dharmam or alms. And this was a very, very fascinating way of thinking, because one thing they mentioned was every being in the forest, including animals and humans, understand the strength and limitations of each other. So to give an example, Kattunayakans are really good at climbing tall trees to gather honey, like very tall trees they could climb. And bears living in those areas who like honey cannot climb these big trees. So every time Kattunayakan communities go for harvesting honey, they often leave behind some crumbs of honey for the bears, because they agree with the fact that they understand bears have that limitations and Kattunayakans have that ability to do the particular process better. In the same way, they find it okay to steal some bit of meat from tiger after tiger is hunted, because they think it's tiger's moral responsibility to share some of the the meat tiger has hunted with Kattunayakan communities, because communities are less equipped in comparison to a tiger to hunt. Even if humans, dogs, or chicken, everyone should do their sacred duty of giving dharma. Whatever we eat, it should be shared with others. For Kattunayakans, coexisting with animals is a bipartisan and intentional action. It's not just them staying in a passive form of existence with the animal, but it's a very much a conversational and a mutual agreement between animals and humans. So while talking to community members, I asked them, like, how would it look like coexistence? And they gave this description, which I tried to like convert it into a kind of an art piece to understand it in the way I could process, was to see the same picture, like, having the presence of a human. Now, the particular way in which indigenous communities, or what you've seen from Kattunayakan understanding, it's far different from dualism or the principles of dualism of separating humans and nature. The communities tend to have a relational thinking or framing when it comes to understanding humans and animal relationship. Now, what is relational framing or relational thinking? Seeing nature as a bundle of relations in which the social, cultural, ecological, historical, and biological aspects of humans and wild animals are intertwined. And this is not a very new concept. So if you ask a lot of anthropologists or maybe human geographers, they would probably tell you that, yes, this is something that we've been witnessing in many communities. And rightly so. You can see the work of Ambika Ayudurai in northeast of India, where she talks about the communities seeing tigers as brothers. Or if you, the very popular book of, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Kimmerer, where she discusses about the humans and nature involving in some kind of a gifting process. Similarly, Enrique Salmon's work, which talks about the kin-centric ecology of having this shared ancestry or shared origin. Similarly, Paul Nadaski's work with the communities in the northern indigenous culture, where they believe that the animals gift themselves to the hunters in those areas. Relational thinking, in some ways, is also an extension of what we see as a principle of multi-species ethnography. Multi-species ethnography, in simple words, would be, rather than seeing animals in one place where they are supposed to be, humans in another space, we can see how humans and other animals coexist, co-create landscapes, and even co-produce each other. Some of the works that you can read more about these kind of philosophies and worldviews would be the Edward Kahn's work, or Anne Singh's work. All these are brilliant work that kind of captures this different ways of understanding human-animal relations. Now, this particular picture was taken by my colleague Amanda Stronza in Botswana, which kind of puts a very visual perspective to multi-species ethnography. So this picture, you can see first picture, second picture, and third picture, the same landscape, the same space, used by elephants, now used by humans, and then used by the dogs. Now this is between 15 minutes each when she was taking this photograph. This kind of shows how intertwined these landscapes and spaces are for all these species living together. Now, it would be such a shame if you don't see the relational framing of these interactions. Now, where are we versus where we need to go? Trying to kind of summarize some of the insights from human-wildlife coexistence existing in social science disciplines and indigenous and traditional knowledge, my colleague and I wrote this kind of review paper where we realized that conservation science is slowly moving away from dualistic thinking, which is great, which is positive. Like at least 20, 30 years ago, this conversation wouldn't have been possible in a space like this. However, relational thinking is still not mainstream. Indigenous epistemologies, while they're very powerful relational frameworks, yet needs to find their space in conservation science. And you must be thinking, why is that not possible? Because it has some fundamental challenges for centering indigenous epistemologies in wildlife conservation. Now, epistemologies mean understanding the way of interacting with something. So that's like how do you engage? What are the philosophies? What are the principles? Indigenous ways of understanding is often based on different worldviews. Now, worldviews that are built on oral histories, stories, lived experiences. These are not quantifiable data. You can't put numbers on that. That would be an injustice or kind of uncomfortable thing to do that. And several of our institutions were built on this understanding of working with information that we fundamentally work are quantitative-based data, not oral histories. Like when we make policies, policies are not built on decisions based on oral histories and lived experiences. It's based on numbers mostly, right? And when we try to bring indigenous understanding, historically, we've taken an example of tokenism, like, having some boxes being checked or like some vague representation or something. And then we feel like we've done the task. It's a good task, right? Asking few community members what it's like. And then there is the historical imbalance. Our mainstream understanding about the world has been so rooted in Western science, which is mostly the Euro-colonial way of looking at it. It's been so rooted that many of these communities, which are extremely marginalized in the history, their knowledge system doesn't really have a space to engage with. And even if they try to engage with the space, they're not given the equal respect and equal, platform to present and represent. The last is the loss and misrepresentation. Many of these knowledge systems are dying across the world, whether it's due to urbanization, modernization. The knowledge holders are elders, and they're finding it hard to translate it to their younger generation. Not because they don't want to. Sometimes they don't have access to. Some of the younger generation don't have access to the ancestral land to practice some of their methods. Considering all these things, in several countries, many indigenous community members, especially elders, started to think, what are the ways of working with Western science, which is often the dominant science in the current world? The Mi'kmaq community elder came up with this idea or philosophy, which is called the two-eyed viewing. The two-eyed viewing builds from this space that when you are seeing something, when you are trying to understand something, look at it from two different lenses. First, close your one eye, look it from a Western lens, and then close that eye, open your new eye with the indigenous lens. Try to understand the multiple ways of knowing things. And there are some brilliant work by Andrea Reed and colleagues who talk about how ecological research can be done in a good way, an ethical way, working with communities. Two-eyed viewing believes and is fundamentally rooted in the idea of building long-term partnerships. It's not working with communities, it's working for communities, prioritizing the trust, the reciprocity. It also involves understanding that there is multiple ways of knowing, understanding that knowledge can exist in form of stories, rituals, relationships. And then it also includes the aspect of, how when we design things, when we design policies, when we design research, how can we engage with communities in an ethical way? A large part of two-eyed viewing also involves cultural revitalization and retaining and using of more indigenous languages and practices. And lastly, the most important part is to approach these kind of understandings with humility and process of unlearning. It's very important that, we need to slow down when we work with communities, especially marginalized communities. Be open to listening, be open to slowing down, and be open to rethinking some of the dominant conservation approaches. Now, integration of indigenous knowledge into practice, like this is a question that I often get when I talk about my work. They're like, oh, this is great. We understand some of the indigenous ontologies, but what do we do now? Like, how do we do it? It's a slow process. Like, it's not something that you can do immediately. We are talking about a knowledge system which has been actively suppressed for years and years, right? By systems and practices and mechanisms and histories and politics. So how do you work with them? Start with baby steps. Start understanding that, policy integration, when we talk about policy integration, it needs to first start with legally recognizing indigenous communities and their rights. It starts with that, understanding the spaces that they belong to, they need to get their rights. And then practice EPIC, which is prior informed consent, FPIC. It's not just ticking a box. It's basically explaining to our community members what this work is going to be, what this policy discussion is going to be, what this management practice is going to be. Give them full information. Let them have the agency to make the decision if they want to go ahead with that. So FPIC need to be followed very strongly in research, whether it's other form of engagement. Education and training, which I strongly believe is bidirectional. It's not just that the indigenous communities need to be educated, but it's about practitioners who are building their knowledge system on Western science. They need to also, come halfway and learn about indigenous mechanisms, and then try to see where you can find that overlap, where you can form that connection. Have traditional ecological focus conservation leadership fellowships, have programs, have more courses and curriculums which are built into a school and colleges, which is fundamentally believing in conservation fundamentally seeing conservation from one lens. Have more of those spaces for future researchers and early career engagement folks to have that space to open up these discussions. Have more field-based practice, build collaborative research, teach students how to do ethical research, how to work with indigenous communities, how to do culturally grounded monitoring, not just ecological monitoring. How can you build indigenous knowledge system into these things? Now, what questions are we not asking? That's more important. Now, I invite each of us sitting here today to sit with a discomfort and curiosity and openness. What must conservation become to truly include other ways of understanding nature? How conservation scientists can integrate these insights into policy, education, and field practice. These are questions I think it's very important as we all move into this world and as we are all working. Maybe many of you are PhD students, many of you are master's students. Try to think about these questions when you're building your research. Like, is there a possibility of working with communities? Is there a way of engaging in some other form of knowledge system which I'm not familiar with? Is there a way? Now, rethinking human-nature relationship is not just a shift. It's not just to shift our conservation strategies, but to reimagine our ethical responsibilities towards skin, land, and life. I would like to end this presentation with this particular quote. Why are you here and what is in your bag? This picture was taken during my field work where the community member was gathering this non-timber forest product. It's kind of a fungus which can be used for developing paint, like varnish or paint. It forms a baseline for that. It's a non-timber forest product. They often go into the forest and collect it. And every time we were inside this forest, when I'm talking forest, it's a protected area. So it's, there is forest management and everybody going there. When a forest officer would see a community member, inevitably they would open their bag. They would look what they are carrying, if they're carrying anything illegal, which is often, hunting is illegal in India. So, are they having some meat or are there things from the forest that are not meant to be collected? I found it very intrusive because they were not checking my bag. And that got me thinking, like, imagine each of us sitting here, if we were to be scanned every time you're walking into the space and somebody says, what's in your bag? Show me what's in it, right? How much can you own that space? Imagine the impact such questions and such mechanisms and such systems being put in place will have on the knowledge systems. How many years of such kind of marginalization has these knowledge systems endured? I'm talking about 2020 and 2016, which is quite recent, right? These questions. For me, there is more to indigenous relationship to land than what is in their bag. That needs to be acknowledged and robustly understood and supported for sustainable, just, and effective solutions. So that ends, and yeah, a few things I've been doing. I'm mostly trying to develop a methodology to work with communities and replicate some of the questions that I'm keen on in different societies. mostly in Asia and countries in Africa, partly because in those areas, definition of indigenous people is very unclear in comparison to, say, a country like Canada or US or Australia or New Zealand, where there is a clear differentiation between settler versus non-settler. But in many parts of the world, indigenous communities don't have that clear identity. And recognition and identity are so fundamental. You know why? Because it translates into their rights at some point. It helps them support indigenous rights movement. So I'm actively trying to work with researchers in these areas and geographies who could collaborate, where we can work together and understand a collection of what indigenous knowledge systems look like in these areas. Yeah, I would like to thank everyone who has been helpful in all these work and collaborations. And yeah, thank you so much. And I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Helina. Let's open for questions. We do have time for quite a few questions. So, who wants to start? Yes, you're gonna have to speak on this little thing. I'll just ask you to be loud so everybody can hear.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you for that presentation. That was really fascinating. I'm not a student in this area. I work on rail strategy. Yeah, I was really interested in the kind of, that scientific lens. How much do you think the issue is that these local communities, as you described, see themselves as part of the forest, leaders of the forest? And do you think that we're looking at them as humans, and maybe that's part of the issue with how we interact with them?
That's a great question. Let me try to understand the question correctly. So you're basically working with a system where you're trying to incorporate maybe traditional people's perspective and trying to see if the lens in which we've been looking at them is from the perspective of them just being humans and not as a part of the system or ecosystem, right? Okay, that's a great question. I'm assuming it's in UK that you're talking about this particular project, or?
Oh, no, yeah, so I work. So I'm not in this field, but I've come in as a public joiner for today. Yeah,
all right.
But just very interested.
Okay, let me try to answer that question. I think it's up to the community to answer what lens they need to be looked at. So I would begin this by just talking to them, trying to see that the learning that you're bringing in, is it the right way of looking at it? So it's basically like kind of co-designing and co-developing. So ask them, being very honest about it. This is what I understand of this system. What do you think? Maybe they would say, yes, they want to be engaged and seen as a part of the system. Maybe not, it depends. But the point is giving them that agency to make that decision, how they need to be seen, rather than being assumed how they need to be seen.
That's really helpful. So it's almost like a consent as to how they want to be perceived.
Absolutely. Like I said, I think giving them the full information of what we know and asking them this is what we know and this is what we are trying to achieve. If it's a project, what do you think we should do? What are your thoughts? What are your experiences? How can we make it better? These are our limitations. How can we work with it?
Thank you.
Any other questions, Sandra?
I wonder if you have detected the same conversation between humans and non-humans with plants.
Nice. Interesting. I wouldn't say any of my published work, I haven't seen it, but yes, while working with community members, they do engage in those form of conversations. So they also what Robin Kimmerer mentions about the gifting, right? In that book, she talks about the berries being accessible to humans, and it's a form of berries gifting themselves to the humans. yes, they do have those conversations, and it's not an intentional conversation. Like, it's more like when they walk around, they see a tuber, they would probably say, hey, you're taking time to grow. I would really appreciate if you grow faster so that we can harvest and things like that. That's my encounter with some of these things. But I'm pretty sure if somebody is to follow specifically plant-human relationship, there will be many instances and stories and experiences that communities can talk about.
Yeah, thank you very much. I've been doing work on coastal economies and trying to think differently. So this is a really interesting talk, and thank you. It's very stimulating. And I wonder if you've come across any work. It seems to me that conservation is value-laden in itself. Fundamentally, it's a value-laden construct of Western nations in particular. And I'm wondering if you've come across any work where people have within the conservation context, but have been thinking about these this relational assemblage of, let's say, a forest or whatever ecosystem it might be, as an economy rather than as a conservation problem. Because it strikes me that really there's an economy there, an indigenous economy, where the animals, the plants, the people themselves all have their particular value. And there's exchange going on and transactions and a sustainability there that's been achieved through generations. Just an interesting thought as I was listening to you speak. Thank you.
Yeah, I have not done work on that, but I think it's a fascinating topic to think about for sure. Like, just by you speaking about it, I can already like kind of picture in my mind, like, how those things would be visually looking like, right? So it would be really interesting to maybe do a study like that and trying to understand. Maybe, I don't know whether economy would be a good term or not, because it seems very transactional. Maybe there are some other indigenous specific terminologies that can be understood. But yes, that would be very fascinating to see in different systems, how it works and, what are those things. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. There you go. And then can you just pass the hand one?
Yes. Yeah. Hi. Thank you. I am curious about, you brought up how the relationship of Indigenous people with wildlife and humans as being more about coexistence and convivial, but also situated in fear and conflict. And I'm just curious, like, how do we get people to see the world and wildlife more in this way, especially in places like the UK, where one's experience with wildlife remains quite limited?
Again, wonderful question. Let's see. I don't have a lot of understanding about UK's wildlife. I don't know whether UK, anyone experience any form of conflict with any animal?
Badgers.
Could be. No, coyote? Yeah. Do you have coyotes?
No, we do have foxes.
Foxes, yeah, but
People don't like foxes sometimes.
yeah. Well, I think part of it is, I'm talking about indigenous knowledge systems, right? So it's kind of an ongoing thing for these communities, probably not as same as UK, which is, I would say, more of a urbanish, maybe even rural, but like it's more like a different system we are talking about. How do we engage people in these conversations would be to start like seminar like this, or like have more people working in these space, engage in discussions with people, have more conservation scientists be open about these discussions. That would be a good start, I would say. I don't know whether I'm doing a good job answering that question, but the fact is that it all starts with conversation, I think, like to bring forward these examples. Like I said, I was trained in zoology. It was really hard for me to come to an understanding and kind of accepting the fact of animal agency or decision making. It took a long time. Now I feel quite comfortable. Maybe maybe deep inside there might be still some kind of skepticism inside me, but I would say overall, I feel okay. And I'm kind of comfortable that there are different ways of looking at nature that's existing, and it's okay to exist that way. For me personally, that's a big learning and a starting point. So I'm sure like there could be something that we can bring together with a team of other people and understand what are the best ways of doing it.
Mine's actually quite related, but I work with mostly UK-based communities, really trying to figure out how they can relate better or act in relation to the environment and so on. And it comes up quite a lot that people say, oh, we need to be more like Indigenous people, we need to learn from Indigenous people. But it feels often like it's a generalized, like the Indigenous people know how to do things, and we need, and then I hear from your example that they're, you know, you're learning about the people and ecosystem interactions of specific people in specific ecosystems, and I'm wondering about what we can learn here, and how, you know, is there anything that's generalizable, or is it what really comes in? And I guess I'm thinking you have got a couple of US projects, haven't you? So maybe there's a bit from that experience that would be relevant.
Again, wonderful question. And I'll try to do my best to answer this. In terms of, I think, what we can learn from Indigenous community members, what I was trying to work is for a particular community in different areas. In general, overall, my research is to understand whether there are these shared understanding across different communities. My geographies have been very limited in terms of like Asia and, you know, other places, mostly post-colonial countries where there is a history of, you know, these knowledge system being actively erased, which is totally the case with US too. So, you know, it's much easier for me to like make that transition of methodologies and question into areas of US. UK would be a very unique case for that matter. Like, to put it very bluntly, like, you know, UK was the epicenter of all the colonization at some point, right? Like, so thinking about what we can learn, I can give you a very beautiful example done by one of my colleagues in Texas. She's a professor at Texas A&M, and she does a project where whenever she sees a roadkill, she picks it up and she creates this beautiful memorial, like, you know, decorated with wildflowers and everything. And she does this spray, like she prays, like, you know, giving kind of a respect. And she's a white woman, American woman, no Indigenous connection, but have worked with a lot of communities across the world in Botswana and Amazon and all these places. And I think that was one of the, probably a philosophy somehow she's picked in, the fact that, you know, every being needs to be respected as they pass over into a new form of living, like, you know, when they die. And I was giving a talk at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and one student who is a veterinary student, she came up to me and she said that, you know, every time I have to dissect an animal which is dead, I always do a little prayer, respecting and acknowledging that this animal did have a life, and it did have a family. Now, those things are very foundational in many Indigenous cultures. Like, you know, if an animal dies or passes away, how they treat the animal rather than a thing of waste or something, but rather giving that respect. So that is something I can think of as an immediate example, like, you know, how we can start building that culture of seeing animals from a different lens. Maybe that's something in UK might be applicable to start thinking with.
Thank you. Do you want to?
You're gonna ask Tony, or no? Can I give the back? Go first.
You're in charge.
Where's it going? How? Tell me what to do with it.
Yeah, I will get back to you.
Okay, thanks. Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. I work with Indigenous local communities in the Amazon. There's a lot of resonance, particularly in your recommendations for how to conduct that interaction. Two questions. One, I understood, or thinking about what you were saying about the community that you worked with in India and its interactions with their animal neighbors. I wondered whether they are a community that do not hunt animals for food. I live with communities that do. You see a monkey or you see a peccary and you hope it's going to be in the pot for dinner. How would you say, in your experience, indigenous communities who are both respectful, as you described, of and coexist with their animal neighbors, but also selectively hunt some of them? How do they see that? And the second question is, you were set in your recommendations for behavior, you talked about seeking free prior informed consent, which is perhaps a step in the right direction, but it's always, it nevertheless leaves the community involved on the back foot. They're starting from the back foot because the initiative in 99.9% of cases is from outside. It's, we want to dam your river. We want to run a road or a transmission line. Let's sit down. We know we want to do the right thing. So let's sit down and talk about how we can mitigate the impacts, how you can derive some benefits, how maybe, you know, we can set up a system of royalties for you. But it's still an initiative they're having to respond to that is more than likely unwelcome. Yeah? That's not really a question. It's just, you know, to emphasize the fact that the relationships are asymmetrical, are always unequal.
I completely agree with the second part of the conversation. Like it's 100% unsymmetric, and very often, you know, even these systems like EPIC was put in place in some way for a lot of systems or people to cleanse, you know, the kind of damage that they are doing, you know, because you just consulted a community member, right? But the decisions were already made. If there was a railway line construction or a dam, you know, at the policy end, the decision was already made. You know, it was just kind of a act to ask these community members. But I feel like it's also an opportunity now that people are getting more educated about things and educated about the marginalization and the erasure that has happened historically. I think it also gives a good opportunity. It also empowers a lot of civil society people when they're being given these tools to engage with communities. Like I said, it's unfair and it's not symmetrical at all. I completely agree, but I always try to see a positive side, and I always look for ways of making it better. Having FPIC is much better than not having, like, so that would be a good start for me, like, you know, irrespective of all the challenges and limitations it might have in reality or practicality. Now, to answer the first question, would be these community members are hunter-gatherers and they've been hunting traditionally. So in 1972, when India had the Wildlife Protection Act, hunting became illegal. So even subsistence-based hunting is not allowed. That being said, community members do engage in trapping and some form of hunting sometimes. And their relationship is, again, built on a very mutually understood idea that, you know, it's their need, they need to have food, so they communicate and do the hunting. But hunting has been banned for a long time. So it's not a conversation a lot of community members would be comfortable to engage in. And I would also think it's probably not in their best interest, given the kind of legal implications they might have if they were to even talk about it, because yeah, it's not allowed. So yeah, I try to like stay away from that, also for protecting the community.
Hello. I'm wondering if you've had any conversations with some of the indigenous communities you've worked with or individuals where you have gleaned any insights as to how they view our alienation from nature malady, shall we say? And then perhaps a related question to an earlier one, do they suggest any medicine for this malady?
Okay. I quite didn't get one word. Sorry.
Which one? Malady, alienation? So we could say that we have there's a crisis of alienation from nature, shall we say? And I'm wondering how they view that in people in the West. What do they have a story that explains the origins of this? Do they have a way of conceptualizing this disconnect? Do they talk of it as an illness, as a madness, as a confusion, as a separation from spirit, or?
Okay. So to answer that question, I would say I've kind of did my PhD and training in Canada, where, had the opportunity to talk to Indigenous community members there and working with a lot of Indigenous scholars. There are some strong origin stories and description about these connections which are existing in these cultures. Now, moving back to a place like India, where communities have been extremely marginalized with other socio-cultural structures like caste system and, other social hierarchies, communities were quite fascinated with the fact that I was even interested to ask them about these relations. I think one part of it is definitely sure that, when you are a community member, you kind of take that as a normal form of thinking. So you don't see anything special in that way. I think it's quite common for all of us, right? Like the way I would do certain things, for me, it's normal, but maybe somebody else who's not seen me would think that, oh, that's quite different, the way she's maybe holding a glass or something, right? So for them, it was fascinating. And I don't think, from my experience working with communities either in India or Sri Lanka or other places, they don't see that as a big deal that needs to be like studied in that aspect. For them, it's more like, this is how we engage with animals. This is how. So to answer that question, when I went into the community and tried to explain my work, the first few weeks, they were not responding to me because they thought I would be a medical professional trying to like get data on their, health and, vaccines and things like that. And when I told them like, no, I'm not anybody to do with government or, any policy person or medical authority. I'm just here to understand your relation with forest. And it took them a while to like really understand, like, okay, this person who is an outsider wants to know about our forest relationship. So they kind of, these questions or any kind of interview when it's being done, there is part of it is confusing for them. Like, why am I doing, right? Like, or why do I pay so much attention? I'm spending time sitting and listening to some of their stories, which historically, I don't think has been given that space and platform to communicate. So there is that question. There is also element of doubt, like, why is she here? Why is she engaging with us? And why is she, what does she want out of it, right? So which is answering to your question, Tony, about like hunting, like, even if they're practicing hunting, is she going to be going back to the forest department to talk about some of our ways? So there is that element, which is where I think the trust building part comes in. So I think it's a combination of a lot of things. I can't give a straightforward answer for that. It's complex, and partly complex because of the history and the social structures, but it's very complex, but it's a combination of a lot of things.
Thank you.
Okay, I think probably it's going to be the last question. Anyone else? So then we can bundle them together. No? Okay. So there you go.
Quite early on, you mentioned like there were 3 recommendations. The first one was study the knowledge system, and the second one was illuminate what's lost.
Yeah.
And I was really interested in how you go about, because something's lost, it's lost, right? So how do you illuminate it? And I think for me, that really relates to what some of the questions here were about the UK. And you said like we exported this, but we had it afflicted on us first. And there's an interesting project, for example, in in East Anglia in the Fens called Henry VIII Hates Us, or Used to Hate Us, which is about how they drained the Fenland wetlands ecosystem and brought in Dutch engineers, and they sort of, it was a kind of cultural and a form of genocide for that group of people there, and that we then were able to export that from the UK to the rest of the world, but we had it sort of inflicted here first. So I'm interested in this sort of illumination of what's lost rather than what can we extract from an indigenous community somewhere else. So if you had something about how you do that, I thought that would be kind of interesting to hear.
I didn't know about that. That's such a new fact for me. Thank you. In terms of that particular one, I can give a very specific example. One would be cultural fire, like suppression of cultural fire. So many parts of the world, cultural burning has been like banned or suppressed during the colonial times, partly because of the misclassification of the ecosystems. So to give an example from Indian subcontinent would be when early settlers, or the European settlers, when they came in, they saw the grasslands and they kind of assumed that they're wastelands, because the idea of a productive land included trees, and having a system of tree and grass was not something they were familiar with. So communities who've been practicing fire, they were asked not to practice fire, and practicing fire was a criminal offense. And even now it's a criminal offense in many parts of the world, even including India. So when I was working with this community, I'm not a fire ecologist at all. I've never dealt with fire or conversations around fire. I've always seen and understood fire as a threat. And so when I was talking to community members, one question that actually led me to fire was, I asked them, what are some of the changes that has happened in the forest from your observation, from what you've heard from your parents or grandparents? How has these systems changed? And all the 70 people I've interviewed, everybody said, we used to have fire before, and we don't have fire anymore. And for me, that was very interesting, because I grew up in those areas and I always seen fire as a threat. And what followed up was this understanding of fire ontologies, how they saw fire, how they practiced fire, which seasons, and which areas, and how the ecosystem looked like, what changes have happened in the water systems, and management practices. So it opened up a new conversation about something that doesn't exist anymore, but that could be useful for a fire ecologist who wants to work on reviving maybe cultural fire. So I feel like that part of my work kind of helps to build a baseline theme of some of these dying knowledge systems. Yeah. I hope I answered the question.
Really quick.
No.
No. There you go.
So living in the West and flying around and all of that stuff, how has doing this research changed the way you live?
Oof, that's a loaded question. I think I would start by saying that I've lived in many places in this life. Born and brought up in India, been in UK to do my master's, and then moved back and went to Canada, now live in US. I would say, I was just talking to Erica during our lunch. I would say I've become a different person from what I was when I was 20-year-old, thinking conservation science would change the world. I have now started seeing the limitations and opportunities from a very different lens. I've become comfortable knowing and accepting that I don't have solutions and I don't know everything. But I know people who might know something, and there's a possibility of all of us to work together. I think that's something I've kind of started understanding and felt. I have developed a newfound understanding for science, indigenous science, and indigenous knowledge. I don't want to use indigenous science as a word, indigenous knowledge. And sometimes I see parallels of how ecologists see ecosystem from what indigenous knowledge sees. It's just that they communicate in two different language, but I see the parallels, and that makes me very excited that there is a possibility of maybe weaving both these together at some point. And another thing is the fact that having lived in some spaces, you automatically assume about things, like, because you kind of become not aware of things because you tend to live there, right? And uprooting yourself from that space and then relaunching yourself into that space also gives you a different perspective sometimes. So I feel like stories like Fire or, Coexistence was not something that I was planning to pursue, to work on, to understand. But I think talking to indigenous communities in Canada or, working with some scholars there, it really gave me an opportunity to like kind of expand the way I was thinking about landscapes. Yeah, so probably a combination of all these things. Yeah.
I'm sorry if I asked in a loaded way.
Oh, no. It was a good question for me to think and reflect to. So that's great. Thank you.
I'd like to thank everyone for coming today. Hope you still have time to enjoy the sun. Unfortunately, today we're not going to have drinks and nibbles, but there's water, I think. So you can stay hydrated, I think. If not, just find